The smell of wet ash and copper hung heavy in the air as Maggie pulled a crisp, white envelope from her father's locked desk. Outside, the Appalachian wind howled through the cracks in the walls. But inside, the only sound was the frantic, wet rattle of her father's breathing in the next room. She smoothed out the document, her coal-stained thumb leaving a dark, permanent smear over a signature that shouldn't have been there. It wasn't her father's shaky script. It was her brother's elegant, arrogant hand, and it sat right beneath a corporate seal that meant their home was no longer theirs. A floorboard groaned behind her. Maggie didn't turn around, but she felt the cold draft from the hallway as the door swung wider. The heavy thud of expensive leather boots echoed against the floor. Boots she had paid for with 12-hour shifts in the dark. "You were never supposed to find that, Maggie." A voice smooth as silk whispered from the shadows. As she gripped the paper, the distant roar of an engine rumbled at the base of the mountain, and the first heavy droplets of a storm began to hammer against the roof like a countdown. The whistle shrieked through the tunnels, a jagged sound that clawed at the eardrums. Maggie's fingers twitched around the pickaxe handle, knuckles white beneath the grime. She didn't need the warning. Her body already knew. The shift was ending, but the quota wasn't met. A cough rattled behind her, wet and phlegmy. Old Tom leaned against the wall, his chest heaving like a broken bellows. "Christ, girl," he wheezed, "you're gonna kill yourself before the coal does." His voice scraped raw, the words dissolving into another fit of hacking. Maggie wiped her sleeve across her mouth, tasting salt and iron. The air hung thick with dust, settling in her throat like wet ash. Words were a luxury down here, wasted breath. Instead, she drove the pickaxe into the seam again, the impact shuddering up her arms. The coal split with a sharp crack, black shards skittering across the floor. She forced herself deeper into the narrow slit of the seam, where the ceiling of black shale seemed to press against her shoulder blades with a weight that felt personal. The air in this particular pocket of the Appalachian foothills was thick, a soup of ancient rot and fine carbon that coated the tongue and turned every breath into a struggle. Each swing of the pick was a calculated rebellion against the exhaustion threatening to liquefy her muscles. Her back burned, a steady, low-frequency fire that radiated from her spine to her fingertips. Beside her, the shadows of men moved in a rhythmic, sluggish dance, their lanterns casting long, distorted shapes against the jagged walls. Maggie didn't look at them. She kept her focus on the glittering black face of the coal, the way it shimmered like a dark jewel under the dim electric glow. A sudden, sharp report echoed through the chamber, a sound distinct from the dull thud of tools. It was the sound of wood screaming, and of wood. Maggie froze, her pickaxe poised mid-air. Above her, a Sosnovia support beam, gray with age and bowed under the tectonic pressure of the mountain, began to splinter. Small geysers of dry sawdust puffed from the cracks. Time didn't slow down. It sharpened. She threw herself sideways, her body reacting with a primal instinct honed by years in the dark. She pressed her spine into the cold, weeping stone of the Streck, just as a roar, like a collapsing cathedral, filled the tunnel. The ground buckled. Tons of slate and earth thundered into the space she had occupied a heartbeat before. A wall of blinding, choking dust swallowed the world, snuffing out the weak light of her lamp. Maggie curled into a ball, coughing until her lungs felt raw, as tiny shards of stone peppered her skin like buckshot. When the roar faded into a series of trickling groans, the silence that followed was heavier than the rock. She sat in the absolute blackness, the only sound the frantic trip hammer of her heart against her ribs. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the fresh debris. The mountain had missed her, but only just. It was a reminder that the earth didn't care about quotas or the girl swinging the steel. She emerged from the mine mouth an hour later, a ghost of soot and sweat. The transition from the subterranean dark to the gray, overcast light of the surface always felt like a betrayal of the senses. Her boots left heavy, black smears on the porch of the family home, a stark contrast to the scrubbed wood. Inside, the air smelled of stale tobacco and the sweet, cloying scent of the expensive pomade her brother favored. Silas Kellaway sat in his high-backed chair by the window, the local newspaper gripped in hands that shook with more than just age. He didn't look up when the door groaned on its hinges. He was too busy reciting a litany of Caleb's virtues, his voice a rasping drone of pride. "He's dining with the board members today, Maggie," Silas said, his eyes fixed on some distant, golden future. "In a suit that costs more than a year of your hauling, he's building a name for us, a real name." Maggie leaned against the doorframe, her legs trembling with a fatigue that went bone deep. She watched her father's profile, the sharp, hooked nose, the skin like translucent parchment. He spoke of Caleb's brilliant prospects in the city as if they were a shared victory, ignoring the fact that the very boots on Caleb's feet were paid for by the black lung and broken nails of the girl standing in the shadows. Caleb was likely at a velvet-lined bar at this very moment, ordering another round of top-shelf whiskey on the family tab, while Maggie struggled to find the strength to wash the coal from her ears. I knew the unfairness of it was a physical weight, heavier than the slate. She retreated to the kitchen, her movements mechanical. Silas's cough started then, a dry hacking sound that seemed to tear at his very ribs. It was the sound of the mine claiming its due years after he'd stepped out of the tunnels. Maggie looked at him and saw the pink-tinged froth on his lips, the way his face took on the color of wet clay. She hurried to the shelf where the medicine stayed, but her hand met only empty glass. The bottles were bone dry, coated in a fine layer of household dust. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Silas was gasping now, his fingers clawing at the tattered upholstery of his chair. Hold on," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her over the rattle in his own chest. She knew there were no more refills at the apothecary, and Caleb hadn't sent money for weeks. Driven by a desperate need, she waited until Silas fell into a fitful, oxygen-starved sleep later that evening. She crept toward his private study, the floorboards groaning under her weight like living things. The room smelled of old paper and the bitter tang of the tobacco Silas shouldn't be smoking. She needed a misplaced receipt, a hidden coin, anything to buy the syrup that kept his lungs from drowning him. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the drawers of the heavy oak desk. She waded through piles of overdue utility notices and rambling letters from Caleb filled with vague promises of wealth. Deep in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers, her hand brushed a cold set of keys. She hesitated, the sound of Silas's labored breathing echoing from the next room, then unlocked the small metal lockbox where the family's most sacred documents were kept. Among the deeds and birth certificates, she found a crisp, white sheet of paper that didn't belong. The letterhead bore the embossed seal of the United Coal Corporation. Maggie's breath hitched as she read the legal jargon. It wasn't a loan or a grant. It was a contract of sale. The document detailed the transfer of all Kellaway lands, the pastures, the timber, the very ground the house sat upon, to the corporation for the purpose of open-pit mining. The house was slated for immediate demolition upon the act's commencement. The world seemed to tilt. This wasn't just a loss of property. It was an erasure. And there, at the bottom of the page, was the signature. The ink was dark, the loops of the letters arrogant and practiced. Caleb Kellaway, he had sold them. While she was breathing in the dust of the deep seams to pay for his silk ties, he had been negotiating the destruction of their history for a payout she would never see. The betrayal felt like a pickaxe to the heart. She looked at the date. Weeks ago. He had sat at their table, eaten the food she provided, and watched their father cough up his life, all while knowing the bulldozers were already fueled. Maggie folded the paper with shaking hands and tucked it inside her work jacket, the sharp edge of the parchment biting into her skin. She didn't light a lamp. She sat in the darkness of the hallway, watching the moon climb over the jagged Appalachian peaks, waiting. It wasn't long before the sound of a jaunty whistle drifted up the path. Caleb arrived in a flurry of expensive wool and confidence, his boots clicking sharply on the porch. He stepped inside, tossing his keys onto the table with a casual clatter, his face lit by a self-satisfied smirk. He caught sight of her in the corner, and his smile faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of boredom. "Still in your filth, Maggie? Honestly, have some self-respect." She didn't answer. She watched him preen in front of the hallway mirror, adjusting his silk cravat. She waited for the moment he would realize the lockbox had been opened. But he was too consumed by his own reflection to notice the storm brewing in the shadows. The next morning, the confrontation was unavoidable. Maggie waited until Silas was at the kitchen table, his morning tea cooling in front of him. She didn't offer a greeting. She simply smoothed the crumpled contract onto the wood, her finger trembling as she pointed to Caleb's signature. "He sold us, duh," she said, her voice cracking with the effort to remain steady. "The corporation is coming. They're going to tear the house down. Caleb signed it all away." She looked at Silas, desperate for a spark of the old fire, for the man who once told her that a Kellaway's land was his soul. But Silas's face didn't crumble in grief. It hardened into a mask of purple-veined fury. He snatched the paper, wadding it into a ball, and threw it directly into Maggie's face. "You spiteful, jealous girl," he bellowed, the effort bringing on a fresh wave of coughing. "You'd forge a document just to drag your brother down? You've always hated him because he has the wit to leave this hole." "Duh! Look at the seal. Look at the signature. I see a daughter who's lost her mind to the coal gas." Silas screamed, knocking his chair over as he stood. Caleb appeared in the doorway then, his expression one of practiced, sorrowful concern. Silas turned to him. "She's trying to say you sold the land, son. Tell her. Tell this liar the truth." Caleb sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. "I warned you, Father. The labor is too much for her. It's affecting her grip on reality. I've seen her talking to the walls in the yard." The lie was so smooth, so effortless, that Maggie felt a surge of pure, unadulterated nausea. Silas didn't need more. He pointed a shaking finger at the door. "Out! I won't have a poison in this house. If you can't honor your brother, you aren't a Kellaway. Get out!" He grabbed her old canvas mining bag and threw it after her. The heavy door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the valley. Maggie stood on the dirt road, the taste of copper in her mouth and the cold wind of the mountains beginning to rise. In the distance, the low rhythmic thrum of heavy machinery signaled the approach of the corporation's scouts. She was alone, homeless, and branded a madwoman by the very people she had bled to protect. The rejection by her own blood was a wound that wouldn't close. She sought refuge at the edge of town, knocking on the door of her oldest friend, Edith. The night was turning frigid, a biting Appalachian frost settling over the ridges. When the door finally creaked open, Edith didn't offer a hug or a warm hearth. She stood in the gap, her face pale, her eyes darting to the shadows behind Maggie. "I can't, Maggie," Edith whispered, her voice trembling. "Caleb was here. He told everyone about the episodes. He said you tried to attack him with a knife. He said the mines broke something in your head." The door clicked shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home final as a coffin lid. Maggie stood in the freezing rain that had begun to fall, a mixture of ice and soot that turned the world into a blurred, gray nightmare. She drifted toward the center of the settlement, drawn by the light of the Krivoy Kylo bar. Through the grime-streaked windows, she saw Caleb. He was the center of a circle of miners, men who had once shared their bread with her in the dark. He was performing, his gestures wide and theatrical. He tapped his temple with a mournful expression, his voice carrying through the thin walls. "It's the methane," she heard him say, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Burnt the poor girl's brains right out. She's convinced the company is coming to bulldoze the ridge. Pure delusion. Best to keep your doors locked, boys. You know how she gets when the fits take her." The men nodded, their faces grim. They looked at the door, as if expecting a monster to burst through. Maggie backed away into the darkness, her heart a cold stone in her chest. The next morning, the physical threat became more than just rumors. She was walking the narrow, winding road toward the old surveyor's office, hoping to find someone who hadn't been bought by Caleb's lies. The mountain air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. Suddenly, a roar erupted from behind the bend. A massive corporation truck, its grill like a wall of rusted iron, surged toward her. The driver didn't slow down. If anything, the engine's pitch rose. Maggie dived for the ditch, her body hitting the jagged rocks and brambles just as the steel beast screamed past. A wave of freezing slush and mud coated her, blinding her for a moment. As she lay in the thorns, gasping for air, she realized this wasn't an accident. It was a warning. The corporation didn't want a madwoman complicating their schedule. Desperation drove her to a different kind of darkness. She knew the local postmaster was a lazy man who spent his afternoons at the tavern. She slipped through the back window of the small, cramped office, the air smelling of ink and damp wool. She began to rifle through the K cubby, her fingers flying through the envelopes. She found it. A thick, heavy envelope with the crest of a London bank. She tore it open, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside was a ledger of debts that made her dizzy. Caleb hadn't just been spending her wages. He had been hemorrhaging money at the Zolotoy Lev casino. The sums were astronomical. Tucked into the back was a handwritten note in Caleb's elegant script. "Payment arrives Friday. Passage for Liverpool booked for Saturday morning. The old man won't last the winter anyway." The cruelty of it was a physical blow. He wasn't just selling the land. He was selling their father's remaining days for a ticket to a life of luxury across the sea. She returned to the house, creeping through the high grass to peer through the window. Silas was slumped in his chair, his skin the color of ash, his breathing a series of wet, agonizing rasps. Caleb sat just feet away at the dining table, oblivious to the man's suffering. He was meticulously counting a stack of banknotes, his tongue poking out in concentration. He looked at Silas once, a flicker of irritation crossing his face at the sound of a particularly loud wheeze before returning to his money. Maggie couldn't stay away. She eased the bedroom window open, reaching in to place the stolen bottle of medicine on the nightstand. "Duh," she whispered. "Please, take it." Silas's eyes snapped open. For a second there was recognition, but it was quickly swallowed by the poison Caleb had planted. He saw the mud on her face, the wildness in her eyes from the truck attack, and he saw a threat. He lunged with a strength born of terror, knocking the bottle from her hand. It shattered against the floor, the dark syrup seeping into the wood like old blood. "Murderous," he wheezed, his voice a ghost of a scream. "You want me dead so you can have his money. Get away!" The sound brought Caleb running. He didn't hesitate. He didn't call the sheriff. He whistled, a sharp, piercing sound. Two large scarred hounds, dogs he'd been training for weeks, burst from the shed. Their eyes were vacant, their jaws dripping with anticipation. Maggie scrambled back, her boots skidding on the wet grass. She ran. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, the baying of the dogs a constant, terrifying pressure at her back. She dived into the mouth of a Zabroshna Stolnya, the old timber creaking in protest. She huddled in the dark, listening to the dogs scratch at the entrance, their growls vibrating through the stone. She stayed there for hours, the cold seeping into her marrow. In the silence of the mine, she looked at the stolen contract again. The date was circled in her mind. 48 hours. That was all that remained before the earth was torn open. As the sun began to set on the final day, the sky over the Appalachians turned a bruised, sickly purple. A storm was rolling in, a true mountain wrecker. The rain began as a steady drone and quickly escalated into a violent deluge. The ground, already saturated by weeks of autumn wet, began to liquefy. From her vantage point, Maggie saw the lights of the house. She saw Caleb, frantic now, hauling the family's heavy oak clock toward a waiting truck. He was looting the house before the company could take it. He slipped in the mud, cursing as the clock, a piece her grandfather had carried over the mountains, smashed into the muck. The roar of the river below the house grew to a deafening pitch. The old bridge, the only way out of the holler, was swaying violently. Maggie knew the signs. The mountain was shifting. A mudslide was inevitable. She ran toward the bridge, her feet sinking into the black sludge. She reached the wooden span just as Caleb's truck began to rumble toward it. She stood in the center, her arms spread wide, a vengeful specter in the rain. "Move, you crazy bitch!" Caleb screamed over the roar of the water. She didn't move. She watched as the supports of the bridge groaned, the wood twisting under the pressure of the debris-choked river. Caleb slammed the truck into gear, intending to ram her. But a sound like 1,000 freight trains erupted from the ridge above them. The earth gave way. A wall of mud, trees, and rock slammed into the rear of the house. The foundation, already weakened by the old mine workings beneath it, shattered. Maggie watched in horror as the right side of the house simply vanished into the dark, the walls folding like paper. Caleb screamed, jumping from the truck as it began to slide backward toward the precipice. He ran back toward the ruins, driven by a sudden, frantic greed. The money! The safe! He disappeared into the leaning remains of the parlor. Maggie followed, her instinct to save her blood overriding the memory of his betrayal. Inside, the air was a thick fog of plaster dust and rain. She saw him. He was pinned beneath a massive structural beam and the heavy iron safe that had fallen through from the floor above. His leg was a mangled mess of white bone and red meat. "Maggie, help me!" he shrieked, his arrogance gone, replaced by the raw, high-pitched terror of a trapped animal. She looked at him. She looked at the 2 steamship tickets that had fluttered out of his pocket, now soaking in a puddle of muddy water. She could leave. She could walk away and let the mountain finish what it started, but she didn't. She grabbed a heavy steel crowbar from the debris. Her muscles, forged in the deep seams of the earth, bunched and strained. She let out a guttural cry of effort, the iron groaning as she pried the beam just enough. "Crawl!" she barked. Caleb dragged himself out, leaving a thick, dark trail on the shattered floorboards. As he collapsed in the mud of the kitchen, a silhouette appeared in the doorway. Silas. He was leaning against the frame, his nightshirt soaked, his eyes wide and clear for the first time in years. He looked at Caleb, who was still clutching a small leather bag of gold coins to his chest, even as he bled. He looked at the tickets on the floor. He looked at Maggie, her hands raw and bleeding from the effort to save the man who had destroyed them. The realization hit the old man like a physical blow. He saw the truth in the wreckage. He saw the Iuda he had raised and the daughter he had discarded. Caleb, sensing the shift, tried one last desperate gambit. He lunged from the floor, his fingers clawing at Maggie's throat. "Give me the contract. I can still fix it. Give it to me." His hand squeezed, cutting off her air. Maggie thrashed, her vision swimming. Suddenly, a shadow fell over them. Silas, moving with a terrifying final strength, raised his heavy Dubovai trost. He brought it down with a sickening crack across Caleb's wrists. Caleb howled, releasing her. Silas stood over him, his chest heaving, his face a mask of righteous stone. He reached down and snatched the bag of gold and the wet tickets from Caleb's grasp. Without a word, he turned and hurled them into the black, churning maw of the mudslide that was consuming the backyard. "You are no son of mine," Silas rasped, his voice carrying the weight of the mountain. "Your name is dead in this valley. Go, before the earth takes what's left of you." Caleb looked at the dark water where his future had vanished. He looked at the cold, hard eyes of his father and the bloody, defiant face of his sister. He scrambled backward, dragging his ruined leg, and disappeared into the howling storm. A broken thing lost to the night. Silas turned to Maggie. He didn't ask for forgiveness. Some things were too heavy for words. He simply leaned his weight onto her shoulder, his hand trembling against her work jacket. Together, they turned away from the ruins of the house and began the long walk up the ridge, toward the only thing the corporation couldn't buy, the truth of the dark, unyielding earth.